Worry creased her forehead now, though, and her hands gripped her cloak too tightly, straining. She would be worried about Fail, certainly, but Megden was with her, he said, and did not need her nod. Megden was always with Fail, it seemed. A treasure, Fail called her, and Linny seemed to consider the woman her daughter, though sometimes Megden did not appear to enjoy that as much as Linny did. I'll get them back, he promised. All of them. His voice almost broke on that. Get on with your work, he went on roughly, hurriedly. I'll eat in a bit. I have to see to... He strode away without finishing. There was nothing he had to see to, nothing he could think of except Fail. He hardly knew where he was heading until his steps took him outside the circle of carts. 100 paces beyond the horse lines, a low, stony ridge thrust a black peak through the snow. From there, he would be able to see the tracks left by Elias and the others. From there, he would see them returning. His nose told him he was not alone well before he reached the narrow crest of the ridge, told him who was up there. The other man was not listening because Perrin crunched his way to the top before he sprang up from where he had been crouching on his heels. Talonvor's gauntleted hands kneaded his long sword hilt, and he peered at Perrin uncertainly. A tall man who had taken hard knocks in his life, he usually was very sure of himself. Perhaps he expected a tirade for not having been there when Fail was taken, though she had rejected the armsman as a bodyguard, rejected any bodyguard. Beyond Bane and Chiad, at least, who apparently did not count. Or maybe he just thought he would be sent away, back to the carts, so Perrin could be alone. Perrin tried to make his face look less like, what had Linny called it? Murder walking? Talonvor was in love with Megden, and would be wed to her soon if Fail's suspicions were correct. The man had a right to keep watch. They stood there on the ridge while twilight fell, and nothing moved in the snowy forest they watched. Darkness came without movement, and without Massima, but Perrin did not even think of Massima. The gibbous moon showed white on the snow, giving nearly as much light as a full moon, it seemed, until scudding clouds began to hide it, and moon shadows raced across the snow, thicker and thicker. Snow began to fall with a dry rustling, snow that would bury traces and tracks. Silent in the cold, the two men stood watching into the snowfall, waiting, hoping.
Chapter 3. Customs. From the first hour after being captured, laboring through the snowy woods, Fail worried about freezing. Breezes stirred and died, stirred and died. Few of the scattered trees still carried leaves, and most of those hung dead and brown. The breezes swirled through the forest unhindered, and small as the gusts were, they carried ice. Perrin hardly entered her thoughts, except for a hope that he somehow learned of Massima's secret dealings, and of the Shido, of course. Even if that trull Berylane was the only one who could tell him now. She hoped Berylane had escaped the ambush and told Perrin everything, and then fallen into a hole and broken her neck. But she had far more pressing concerns than her husband. She had called this weather autumnal, yet people froze to death in a Saldaean autumn, and of her clothes she retained only her dark woolen stockings. One lashed her elbows tight behind her back, while the second had been tied around her neck for a leash. Brave words made scant covering for bare skin. She was too cold for sweat, yet her legs soon ached with the struggle to keep up with her captors. The Shido column, veiled men and maidens, slowed when the snow rose toward their knees, but immediately resumed a steady trot when it sank toward their ankles, and they did not seem to tire. Horses could not have moved faster over the distance. Shivering, she labored on at the end of her leash, doing her best to gulp air through teeth gritted to stop their chattering. The Shido were fewer than she had estimated during the attack, no more than 150, she thought, and nearly all carried spears or bows at the ready. Small chance anyone could surprise them. Always alert, they ghosted along in silence except for the faint crunch of the snow under their soft, knee-high boots. The greens and grays and browns of their clothing stood out against the white landscape, though. Green had been added to the cut-in sore since crossing the dragon wall, so Bane and Chiad had told her, to aid concealment in a green land. Why had these people not added white for the winter? As it was, they could be seen at some distance. She tried to notice everything, remember anything that might prove useful later when it came time to escape. She hoped her fellow prisoners were doing as much. Perrin would be hunting for her, certainly, but the thought of rescue never entered her calculations. Wait for rescue, and you might wait forever. Besides, they needed to escape as quickly as possible before their captors joined with the rest of the Shido. She could not see how yet, but there must be a way. The one bit of luck was that the main body of Shido must be days distant. This part of Amadisia was chaos, but thousands of Shido could not be too near without her having heard of them. Once, early on, she tried to look back at the women who had been captured with her, but the only result was a stumbling fall into a snowbank. Half buried in the white powder, she gasped from the icy shock, and gasped again when the great hulking Shido who held her leash set her back on her feet. As wide as Perrin and a full head taller, Roland simply hauled her upright by a fistful of her hair, set her moving again with a brisk slap on her bare bottom, and once more took up the long strides that forced her to step quickly. The slap might have been given to make a pony move. Despite her nakedness, there was nothing of a man looking at a woman in Roland's blue eyes. Part of her was very grateful. Part of her was vaguely taken aback. She certainly didn't want him gazing at her with lust or even interest, but those bland glances were almost insulting. After that she made sure not to fall, though as the hours passed without a pause in the march, simply staying upright became more and more of an effort. In the beginning she worried over which bits of her would freeze first, but by the time morning had rolled into afternoon without a pause in the march, she was focused on her feet. Roland and those ahead of him trampled a sort of path for her, yet enough snow crust remained for sharp edges, and she began to leave red stains freezing in her footprints. Worse was the cold itself. She had seen frostbite. How long before her toes began to turn black? Staggering, she flexed each foot as she swung it forward and worked her hands constantly. Fingers and toes were in the worst danger, but any exposed skin was at risk. About her face and the rest of her she could only hope. The flexing hurt, making the cuts on her feet burn, but any feeling was better than none. When sensation went, she would have very little time left. Flex and stride, flex and stride. That filled her thoughts. She kept moving on quivering legs, and kept her hands and feet from freezing. She kept moving. Abruptly she stumbled into Roland and rebounded from his wide chest, panting. Half dazed, or maybe more than half, she had not realized that he had stopped. So had the others ahead, a few looking back, the rest looking outward and warily on guard, weapons up, as though expecting attack. That was all she had time to see before Roland seized a handful of her hair again and bent to lift one of her feet. Light! The man really was treating her like a pony. Releasing her hair and her foot, he snaked an arm around her legs, and the next moment her vision whirled as she was heaved up onto his shoulder, head down beside the horn bow cased on his back. Indignation welled up as he casually shifted her about to find the easiest position for carrying, but she tamped it down as fast as it rose. This was no place or time. Her feet were out of the snow. That was what mattered, and she could catch her breath like this. He could have warned her, though. With an effort, she arched her neck so she could see her companions and felt relief to find them all still there. Naked prisoners, true, but she was sure only a corpse would have been left behind. The others who walked were leashed with stockings or strips of cloth cut from their lost garments, and most also had their arms tied behind. Alejandra was no longer trying to bend double in an attempt to shield herself. Other concerns had replaced modesty for the Queen of Gildan. Panting and trembling, she might have fallen if the squat Shido examining her feet had not supported her by her bound elbows. Squat for an Aiel meant he could have passed unremarked most places, except for shoulders nearly as wide as Roland's. The dark hair spilling down Alejandra's back was wind-blown, her face haggard. Behind her, Magden appeared in almost as bad a state, gulping air, red gold hair in disarray and blue eyes staring, yet she managed to stay erect on her own, with a bone-lean maiden lifting her foot. Somehow Fail's maid looked more a queen than Aleandra did, if a very disheveled queen. In comparison, Bane and Chiad seemed in no worse state than did the Shido, though Chiad's cheek was yellowing and swollen from a blow when they were first taken, and the black blood matting Bane's short fiery hair and spread across her face seemed to have frozen. That was bad. That could scar. The two maidens were not breathing hard, though, and even raised their own feet for examination. Alone of the prisoners, they were unbound, except by custom stronger than chains. They had calmly accepted their fate, to serve a year and a day as Gaishain. Bane and Chiad might be of some help in escaping. Fail was not sure how far custom constrained them, but they themselves would not try to get away. The last prisoners, Lasil and Arala, attempted to pattern themselves after the maidens, of course with indifferent success. A tall Aiel man had simply tucked tiny Lasil under his arm to look at her feet, and crimson mortification stained her pale cheeks. Arala was tall, but the pair of maidens who had charge of her were taller than Fail herself, and they handled the Tyran woman with impersonal ease. A scowl contorted her dark face at their prodding, and maybe at the rapid hand talk they were exchanging. Fail hoped she would not make trouble. Not now. Everyone in Chah Fail tried to be like the Aiel, to live as they thought the Aiel did, but Arala wanted to be a maiden, and she resented the fact that Sulin and the others would not teach her hand talk. She would have been worse if she knew Bane and Chiad had taught Fail a little. Not enough to make out more than every other word the maidens were saying now, but some. As well, Arala could not understand. They thought the Wetlander had soft feet, that she was altogether too pampered and soft, and that surely would have set the woman off. As it turned out, Fail need not have worried about Arala. The Tyran stiffened when one of the maidens hefted her onto a shoulder. Pretending to stagger, the burdened woman used her free hand to flicker a message that made the other maiden bark a laugh behind her veil. But after a glance at Bane and Chiad, already meekly belly down on Aielman's shoulders, Arala sullenly let herself hang limp. Lasil squealed when the big man holding her abruptly spun her about to land in the same position, but she quieted after that, though her face was still bright scarlet. There were definite advantages to their emulation of Aiel. Aleandra and Magden, however, the last women Fail would have expected to cause problems, were another matter entirely. When they realized what was happening, the pair of them fought wildly. It was not much of a fight, two naked and exhausted women with their elbows bound tight behind their backs, but they twisted and shouted and kicked at anyone who came within reach, and Magden even sank her teeth into the hand of a careless Aiel man, hanging on like a boar-hound. "Stop it, you fools!" Fail called to them. "Aleandra! Magden! Let them carry you! Obey me!" Neither her maid nor her vassal paid the slightest heed. Magden growled like a lion around her mouthful of Aiel. Aleandra was wrestled down, still shouting and flailing with her feet. Fail opened her mouth for another command. "The Gaishain will be quiet," Roland grunted, spanking her hard. She ground her teeth and muttered under her breath, which earned another slap. The man had her knives tucked behind his belt. If she could lay hands on just one... No. What must be endured could be endured. She intended to escape, not make useless gestures. Magden's fight lasted a little longer than Aleandra's, until a pair of burly men could pry her jaws from the Shido's hand. It required a pair. To Fael's surprise, instead of cuffing Magden, the bitten fellow shook blood off his hand and laughed. That did not save her, though. In a trice, Fael's maid was face down in the snow alongside the queen. They were given only a few moments to gasp and writhe in the added cold. Two Shido, one a maiden, appeared out of the surrounding trees, shaving the stubs from long switches with their heavy belt knives. A foot planted between each woman's shoulder blades, a fist on bound elbows to raise fluttering hands out of the way, and red welts began to bloom on white hips. At first, both women continued to fight, twisting about despite the way they were held. Their struggle was even more useless than when they were upright. Little moved above their waists beyond tossing heads and wildly waving hands. Alejandra kept shrilling that they could not do this to her, understandable coming from a queen, if foolish in the circumstances. Plainly they could, and they were. Surprisingly, Magdan raised her voice in the same piercing denials. Anyone would have thought her royalty instead of a lady's maid. Fael knew for a fact that Leni had taken a switch to Magdan without all these histrionics. In any case, denials did no good for either woman. The methodical thrashings continued until they both were kicking and howling wordlessly, and a little longer for good measure. When they were finally hoisted like the other prisoners, they hung weeping, all fight gone out of them. Fael felt no sympathy. The fools had earned every stripe, in her opinion. Frostbite and cut feet aside, the longer they remained outside without clothes, the more chance that some of them might not survive to escape. The Shido had to be taking them to some sort of shelter, and Alejandra and Magdan had delayed reaching it. Maybe it was little more than a quarter-hour's delay, but minutes could be the difference between the living and the dead. On top of which, even Aiel would surely let down their guard a little once they found shelter and made fires. And they could rest, being carried. They could be ready to take their chance when it came. Carrying their prisoners, the Shido set out again at that ground-covering pace. If anything, they seemed to move through the forest more quickly than before. The hard leather bow case bumped Fael's side as she swayed, and she began to feel dizzy. Roland's every long stride sent a jolt through her middle. Surreptitiously, she tried to find some position where she would not be poked and thudded quite so vigorously. "Be still, or you will fall," Roland muttered, patting her hip as he might have patted a horse to soothe it. Raising her head, Fael peered back at Alejandra, scowling. There was not much to be seen of the Queen of Gildan, and that crisscrossed by scarlet welts from the tops of her hips almost to the backs of her knees. Come to think of it, a short delay and a few stripes might be a small price to pay for biting a chunk out of this oaf, toting her like a sack of grain. Not his hand, though. His throat would be about right. Bold thoughts, and worse than useless. Foolish. Even being carried, she knew she must fight the cold. In some ways, she began to realize, being carried was worse. Walking, at least she had had the struggle to stay erect and on her feet to keep her awake. But as evening came on and deepened to darkness, the swaying motion on Roland's shoulders seemed to have a lulling effect. No, it was the cold that was numbing her mind, making her blood sluggish. She had to fight it, or she would die. Rhythmically, she worked her hands and bound arms, tensed her legs and relaxed them, tensed and relaxed, forcing her muscles to work her blood. She thought of Perrin, solid planning thoughts of what he should do about Massima and how she could convince him if he balked. She went over the argument they would have when he learned she had been using Chafail as spies, planned how she would meet his anger and turn it. There was an art to guiding a husband's anger in the direction you wanted, and she had learned from an expert, her mother. It would be a splendid argument, and a splendid making up after. Thinking about making up with him made her forget to work her muscles, so she tried to concentrate on the argument, on the planning. Cold dulled her thoughts, though. She began losing the thread, having to shake her head and start over. Roland's growls at her to be still helped, a voice to focus on, to keep her awake. Even the accompanying slaps on her upturned bottom helped, as much as she hated to admit the fact, each one a shock that jolted her to wakefulness. After a while she began shifting more, then struggling almost to the point of falling, courting the rude smacks. Anything to stay awake. She could not have said how much time passed, but her twists and wriggles began to weaken until Roland no longer growled, much less gave her a slap. Light. She wanted the man to play her like a drum. Why in the light would I want a thing like that, she thought dully, and a dim corner of her mind realized the battle was lost. The night seemed darker than it should be. She could not even make out the glow of moonlight on the snow. She could feel herself sliding, though, sliding faster and faster toward a deeper dark. Wailing silently, she sank into a stupor. Dreams came. She was sitting on Perrin's lap, with his arms so tight around her she could barely move, before a great fire roaring in a broad stone fireplace. His curly beard scratched her cheeks as he nipped her ears almost painfully. Suddenly a huge wind howled through the room, snuffing the fire like a candle, and Perrin turned to smoke, but vanished in the gale. Alone in bitter darkness she fought the wind, but it tumbled her end over end until she was so dizzy she could not tell up from down. Alone and endlessly tumbling into icy dark, knowing she would never find him again. She ran across a frozen land, floundering from snowdrift to snowdrift, falling, scrambling up to run on in panic, gulping air so cold it sliced her throat like shards of glass. Icicles sparkled on stark branches around her, and a frigid wind keened through the leafless forest. Perrin was very angry, and she had to get away. Somehow she could not recall the specifics of the argument, just that somehow she had pushed her beautiful wolf to real anger, to the point of throwing things. Only Perrin did not throw things. He was going to turn her over his knee, as he had done once, long ago. Why was she running from that, though? There would still be the making up, and she would make him pay for the humiliation, of course. Anyway, she had drawn a little blood from him a time or two with a well-aimed bowl or pitcher, not really meaning to, and she knew he would never really hurt her. But she also knew that she had to run, to keep moving, or she would die. If he catches me, she thought dryly, at least part of me will be warm. And she began to laugh at that, until the dead white land spun around her, and she knew that soon she would be dead too. The monstrous bonfire loomed over her, a towering pile of thick logs roaring with flame. She was naked and cold, so cold. No matter how near the fire she edged, her bones felt frozen, her flesh ready to shatter at a blow. She moved closer, closer. The heat of the blaze grew till she flinched at it, but the bitter cold remained trapped inside her skin. Closer. Oh, light, it was hot, too hot, and still cold within. Closer. She began to scream at the burning, the searing pain, but she was still ice inside. Closer, closer. She was going to die. She shrieked, but there was only silence and the cold. It was daylight, but leaden clouds filled the sky. Snow fell in a steady shower, feathery flakes swirling in the wind through the trees. Not a fierce wind, but it licked with tongues of ice. Ridges of white built on branches until they were tall enough to collapse from their own weight and the wind, sending heavier showers to the ground below. Hunger gnawed her belly with dull teeth. A very tall, bony man with a white woolen cowl sheltering his face forced something into her mouth, the rim of a large clay mug. His eyes were a startling green, like emeralds, and surrounded by puckered scars. He was kneeling on a large brown woolen blanket with her, and another blanket, striped in gray, was draped around her nakedness. The taste of hot tea, thick with honey, exploded on her tongue, and she seized the man's sinewy wrist weakly with both hands in case he tried to take the mug away. Her teeth chattered against the mug, but she gulped the steaming, syrupy liquid greedily. "Not too fast. You must not spill any," the green-eyed man said meekly. Meekness sounded odd from that fierce face, and in a gravelly voice. "They offended your honor, but you are a wetlander, so maybe it does not count with you." Slowly it dawned on her that this was no dream. Thought came in a trickle of shadows that melted if she tried to hold them too hard. The white-robed brute was Guy Shine. Her leash and bonds were gone. He pulled his wrist away from her feeble grip, but only to pour a dark stream from a leather water bag hanging from his shoulder. Steam rose from the mug, and the aroma of tea. Shivering so hard she almost fell over, she clutched the thick striped blanket around her. Fiery pain was blossoming in her feet. She could not have stood had she tried. Not that she wanted to. The blanket managed to cover everything but her feet so long as she remained in a crouch. Standing would have bared her legs, and maybe more. It was warmth she thought of, not decency, though there was little of either to be had. Hunger's teeth grew sharp, and she could not stop shaking. She was frozen inside, the tea's heat already just a memory. Her muscles were week-old congealed pudding. She wanted to stare at the filling mug, coveting the contents, but she made herself look for her companions.
Right
They
back,
were all
everyone.
there in a line with her, Magdin and Alejandra and everyone, slumped on their knees atop blankets, shivering inside blankets speckled with snow. In front of each, a guy shine knelt with a bulging water bag and a mug or cup, and even Bane and Chiad drank like women half dead of thirst. Someone had cleaned the blood from Bane's face, but unlike the last time Fail had seen them, the two maidens were as drawn and unsteady as anyone else. From Aleandra to Lucille, her companions looked, what was Perrin's phrase? As if they had been dragged through a knothole backwards. But everyone was still alive. That was the important thing. Only the living could escape. Roland and the other Algai de Siswai who had had charge of them made a cluster at the far end of the kneeling line. 5 men and 3 women, the snow on the ground nearly knee-deep on the maidens. Black veils hanging down their chests, they watched their prisoners and the guy shine impassively. For a moment she frowned at them, trying to grasp a slippery thought. Yes, of course. Where were the others? Escape would be easier if the rest had gone for some reason. There was something more, another misty question she could not quite catch. Suddenly, what lay beyond the 8 Aiel leaped out at her, and question and answer came at the same time. Where had the guy shine come from? 100 paces or so distant, veiled by the scattered trees and falling snow, a steady stream of people and pack animals, wagons and carts was flowing by. Not a stream, a flood of Aiel on the move. Instead of 150 Shido, she had the whole clan to contend with. It seemed impossible that so many people could pass within a day or two of Avila without raising some alarm, even with the countryside in anarchy, but the proof was right in front of her eyes. Inside she felt leaden. Maybe escape would be no harder, but she did not believe it. How did they offend me? She asked jerkily, then clamped her mouth shut to stop chattering, and opened it again as the guy Shine raised the mug to her once more. She gulped the precious heat, choking, and forced herself to swallow more slowly. The honey, so thick it would have been cloying any other time, dulled her hunger a little. You wetlanders know nothing, the scarred man said dismissively. Gaishine are not clothed in any way until they can be given proper robes, but they feared you would freeze to death and all they had to wrap you was their coats. You were shamed, named as weak, if wetlanders have shame. Roland and many of the others are Meridin, yet Fallon and the rest should know better. Fallon should not have allowed it. Shamed? Infuriated was more like it. Unwilling to turn her head from the blessed mug, she rolled her eyes toward the hulking giant who had carried her like a sack of grain and smacked her unmercifully. Vaguely, she seemed to recall welcoming those spanks, but that was impossible. Of course it was impossible. Roland did not look like a man who had half-trotted through most of a day and a night besides, carrying someone. His white misted breath came easily. Meridin? She thought that would mean brotherless in the old tongue, which told her nothing, but there had been a note of scorn in the guy Shine's voice. She would have to ask Bane and Chiad, and hope it was not one of those things Aiel would not talk about to wetlanders, not even wetlanders who were close friends. Any piece of knowledge might aid escape. So they had wrapped their prisoners up against the cold, had they? Well, no one would have been in any danger of freezing except for Roland and the others. Still, she might owe him a small favor. Very small, considering everything. Perhaps she would only slice off his ears, if she ever got the chance, surrounded by thousands of Shido. Thousands? The Shido numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and tens of thousands of those were Algai de Siswai. Furious with herself, she fought despair. She would escape. They would all escape, and she would take the man's ears with her. I will see Roland's repaid as he deserves, she muttered, when the guy Shine took the mug away for refilling again. He gave her a narrow-eyed, suspicious stare, and she hurried. As you say, I am a wetlander. Most of us are. We don't follow Ito. By your customs, we shouldn't be made guy Shine at all, is that not right? The man's scarred face did not change, not by so much as the twitch of an eyelid. A dim thought said it was too soon. She did not know the ground yet, but thoughts gelid with cold could not catch her tongue. What if the Shido decide to break other customs? They might decide not to let you go when your time is done. The Shido break many customs, he told her placidly, but I do not. I have over half a year yet to wear white. Until then I will serve as custom demands. If you can talk so much, maybe you have had enough tea. Fail clumsily snatched the mug from him. His eyebrows lifted, and she rearranged her draperies one-handed as quickly as she could manage, her cheeks heating. He certainly knew he was looking at a woman. Light. She was blundering about like a blind ox. She had to think, to concentrate. Her brain was the only weapon she had, and at the moment it might as well have been frozen cheese. Drinking deep of the hot, sweet tea, she set herself to thinking of some way that being surrounded by thousands of Shido could be turned to advantage. Nothing came to her, though. Nothing at all. Chapter 4. Offers. What have we here? A woman's hard voice said. Fail looked up and stared, hot tea gone from her thoughts for the moment. Two Aiel women with a much shorter Gaishain woman between them came out of the swirling snow, sinking halfway up their calves in the white carpet that covered the ground, but still making powerful strides. The taller women did anyway. The Gaishain stumbled and floundered, trying to keep up, and one of the others had a hand on her shoulder to make sure she did. All three were worth a stare. The woman in white kept her head meekly down as much as she could, and her hands folded in her wide sleeves as a Gaishain was supposed to, but her robes had the sheen of heavy silk of all things. Gaishain wore forbidden jewelry, yet a wide, elaborate belt of gold and fire drops cinched her waist, and a matching collar was just visible inside her cowl, nearly covering her neck. Very few besides royalty could afford the like. Strange as the Gaishain was, however, it was the others Fail studied. Something told her they were wise ones. There was too much authority about them for anything else. These were women used to giving orders and being obeyed. Beyond that, though, their simple presence caught the eye. The woman pushing the Gaishain along, a stern, blue-eyed eagle with a dark gray shawl wrapped around her head, stood a good span in height, as much as most Aiel men, while the other was at least half a hand taller than Perrin. She was not bulky, though, except in one particular. Sandy yellow hair flowed to her waist, held back from her face by a wide, dark kerchief, and her brown shawl lay across her shoulders, open enough to show an incredible amount of bosom thrusting half out of her pale blouse. How did she avoid freezing, exposing so much skin in this weather? All those heavy necklaces of ivory and gold must feel like bands of ice. As they stopped in front of the kneeling prisoners, the eagle-faced woman frowned disapprovingly at the Shido who had captured them, and made a curt gesture of dismissal with her free hand. For some reason she continued to hold on to the Gaishain's shoulder tightly. The three maidens turned immediately, hurrying toward the passing throng of Shido. One of the men did as well, but Roland and the rest exchanged flat-eyed looks before they followed. Perhaps it meant something, perhaps nothing. Fail suddenly knew how someone in the whirlpool felt, grabbing desperately at straws. What we have is more Gaishain for Savannah, the incredibly tall woman said in amused tones. She had a strong face that some might call pretty, but alongside the other wise one she seemed soft. Savannah will not be satisfied until the entire world is Gaishain, Tharava. Not that I would object to that myself, she finished with a laugh. The eagle-eyed wise one did not laugh. Her face was stone. Her voice was stone. Savannah has too many Gaishain already, Somerin. We have too many Gaishain. They slow us to a crawl when we should race. Her iron stare ran along the kneeling line. Fail flinched when that gaze touched her and hurriedly buried her face in the mug. She had never seen Tharava before, but in that glance she knew the woman's sort, eager to crush any challenge utterly, and capable of seeing challenge in a casual glance. Bad enough when it was only a fool noble at court, or someone encountered on the road, but escape could become more than difficult if this eagle took a personal interest. Just the same, she watched the woman from the corner of her eye. It felt like watching a banded adder, scales glittering in the sun, coiled a foot from her face. Meek, she thought. I am kneeling here meekly, with no thought in my head but drinking my tea. No need to look at me twice, you cold-eyed witch. She hoped the others saw what she did. Alejandra did not. She tried to rise to her swollen feet, tottered, then sank back to her knees with a wince. Even so, she knelt upright in the falling snow, head high, a red-striped blanket held around her as if it were a fine silk shawl over a splendid gown. Bared legs and wind-blown hair spoiled the effect somewhat, yet she was still arrogance on a pedestal. I am Alejandra Maritha Kigarin, Queen of Gildan, she announced loudly, very much queen, addressing ruffian vagabonds. You would be wise to treat me and my companions well and punish those who have handled us so crudely. You can gain a large ransom for us, larger than you can imagine, and pardon for your crimes. My liege lady and I will require suitable accommodation for ourselves until arrangements can be made, and for her maid. Lesser will do for the others, so long as they are not harmed. I will pay no ransom if you ill-treat the least of my liege lady's servants. Fail could have groaned. Did the idiot woman think these people were simple bandits? Only she had no time to. Is that true, Galina? Is she a wetlander queen? Another woman rode out from behind the prisoners, her tall black gelding walking softly in the snow. Fail thought she must be Aiel, but she was unsure. It was difficult to say for certain with the other woman on horseback, but she seemed at least as tall as Fail herself, and few women were except among the Aiel, certainly not with those green eyes and a sun-dark face. And yet, that wide dark skirt looked like the Aiel women's at a glance, but it was divided for riding and appeared to be silk, as was her creamy blouse, and the hem revealed red boots in her stirrups. The wide folded kerchief that held back her long golden hair was brocaded red silk, and a thumb-thick circlet of gold and fire-drops nestled over it. In contrast to the wise one's worked gold and carved ivory, her ropes of fat pearls and necklaces of emeralds and sapphires and rubies half hid nearly as much bosom as Somerin had on display. The bracelets climbing almost to her elbows differed from those worn by the two wise ones in the same way, and Aiel did not wear rings, but gems sparkled on every finger. Instead of a dark shawl, a bright crimson cloak, bordered with golden embroidery and lined with white fur, flared around her in the stiff breeze. She did sit her saddle with the awkwardness of Aiel on horseback, though. And the queen's, her tongue tripped unfamiliarly. Liege lady? That means the queen swore oath to her? A truly powerful woman, then. Answer me, Galina. The silk-clad Gaishain hunched her shoulders and favored the mounted woman with a groveling smile. A truly powerful woman to have a queen swear fealty, Savannah, she said eagerly. I've never heard of the like, yet I think she is who she claims. I saw Alejandra once, years ago, and the girl I recall could well have grown into this woman, and she was crowned Queen of Gildan. What she is doing in Amadisia, I don't know. The White Cloaks or Rodron, either one, would snap her up in an instant if they— Enough, Lena, Tharava said firmly. The hand on Galina's shoulder tightened visibly. You know I hate it when you natter. The Gaishain flinched as if struck, and her mouth snapped shut. Practically writhing, she smiled up at Tharava, fawning even more wretchedly than she had for Savannah. Gold flashed on one of her fingers as she wrung her hands. Fear flashed in her eyes, too. Dark eyes. Definitely not Aiel. Tharava seemed oblivious to the woman's truckling. A dog had been called to heel and had obeyed. Her attention was all on Savannah. Somerin eyed the Gaishain sideways, her lips twisting with contempt, but she folded her shawl across her bosom and looked to Savannah as well. Aiel did not give away much on their faces, yet plainly she disliked Savannah, and was wary of her at the same time. Fail's eyes followed the mounted woman, too, over the edge of her mug. In a way, it was like seeing Logain or Mazrim Taim. Savannah also had painted her name across the sky in blood and fire. Kyrian would need years to recover from what she had wrought there, and the ripples had spread to Andor and Tyr and beyond. Perrin laid the blame to a man called Kuladin, but Fail had heard enough of this woman to have a shrewd idea whose hand had been behind it all, and no one disputed that the slaughter at Dumais Wells was Savannah's fault. Perrin had almost died there. She had a personal claim on Savannah for that. She might be willing to let Roland keep his ears if she could settle that claim. The flamboyantly garbed woman walked her mount slowly along the line of kneeling women, her steady green eyes almost as cold as Tharava's. The sound of snow crunching beneath the black's hooves suddenly seemed loud. "Which of you is the maid?" An odd question. Magdan hesitated, tight-jawed, before raising a hand from beneath her blanket. Savannah nodded thoughtfully. "And the liege lady?" Fail considered holding back, but one way or another Savannah would learn what she wanted to know. Reluctantly, she lifted her hand, and shivered from more than the cold. Tharava was watching with those cruel eyes, paying close attention to Savannah and to those she marked out. How anyone could be unaware of that auguring gaze, Fail did not understand, yet Savannah seemed so as she turned her gelding down the back of the line. "They cannot walk on those feet," she said after a moment. "I do not see why they should ride with the children. Heel them, Galina." Fail gave a start and almost dropped the clay mug. She pushed it toward the Guy Shine, trying to make out that that was what she had been doing all along. It was empty anyway. The scarred fellow calmly began filling it up again from his water bag of tea. Heel? Surely she could not mean... "Very well," Tharava said, giving the Guy Shine woman a shove that staggered her. "Do it quickly, little Lena. I know you do not want to disappoint me." Galina caught herself from falling, but only to struggle on toward the prisoners. She sank above her knees in places, her robes dragging in the snow, but she was intent on reaching her goal. Wide-eyed fear and revulsion mingled in her round face with, could it be, eagerness? All in all, it was a sickening combination. Savannah completed her circuit, coming back to where Fail could see her clearly, and reined in, facing the Wise Ones. The woman's full mouth was tight. The icy breeze rippled her cloak, but she seemed unaware of it, or of the snow falling on her head. "I have just received word, Tharava." Her voice was calm, though lightning bolts should have been flashing from her eyes. "Tonight we camp with the Jonine." "A fifth sept," Tharava replied flatly. For her also, wind and snow might as well not have existed. "5, while 78 remains scattered on the wind. Well that you remember your pledge to reunite the Shido, Savannah. We will not wait forever." Not lightning bolts now. Savannah's eyes were green volcanoes erupting. "I always do what I say, Tharava. Well that you remember that, and remember that you advise me. I speak for the clan chief." Wheeling her gelding, she drummed her heels on the animal's ribs, trying to make him gallop back toward the river of people and wagons, though no horse could do so in that depth of snow. The black managed something faster than a walk, but not much. Their faces expressionless as masks, Tharava and Somerin watched horse and rider fade into the falling white veil. An important exchange, at least to Fail. She knew tension tight as a harp-string when she saw it, and mutual hatred. A weakness that might be exploited, if she could puzzle out how. And it seemed the Shido were not all here after all, though more than enough seemed to be, judging by the unending river of them passing by. Galina reached her then, and anything else fled from her mind. Smoothing her face to a ragged semblance of composure, Galina clutched Fail's head in both hands without speaking a word. Fail might have gasped, she could not be sure. The world seemed to fly by as she jerked halfway
Give me
to her
1 second,
feet.
everyone. I'll be right back.
Hours streaked by, or heartbeats crawled. The white-clad woman stepped back, and Fail collapsed on her face atop the brown blanket to lie panting against the rough wool. Her feet no longer hurt, but healing always brought its own hunger, and she'd eaten nothing since yesterday's breakfast. She could have wolfed down plates of anything that even looked like food. She no longer felt tired, but her muscles were water instead of pudding. Pushing herself up with arms that wanted to fold under her weight, she unsteadily gathered the gray-striped blanket again. She felt stunned as much by what she had seen on Galina's hand just before Galena seized her, as she did by the healing. Gratefully she let the scarred man hold the steaming mug to her mouth. She was not sure her fingers could have held on to it. Galena was wasting no time. A dazed Alejandra was just attempting to rise from flat on her face, a striped covering blanket sliding to the ground unnoticed. Her welts were gone, of course. Magdan still lay sprawled between her two blankets, loose limbs poking out in every direction, and twitching as she feebly tried to collect herself. Chiad, with Galena's hands on her head, lurched all the way to her feet, arms flung wide, breath leaving her in a loud rush. The yellowed swelling on her face faded away even as Fail watched. The maiden dropped as if poleaxed when Galena moved on to Bane, though she began stirring almost at once. Fail attended to her tea, and Furious thought. The gold on Galena's finger was a great serpent ring. She might have thought it a strange present from whoever gave the woman her other jewels, if not from the healing. Galena was Aes Sedai. She must be. But what was an Aes Sedai doing here in Gaishine robes? Not to mention apparently ready to lick Savannah's wrist and kiss Tharava's feet. An Aes Sedai. Standing over a limp Caroline, the last in the line, Galena panted slightly from the effort of healing so many so quickly, and gazed at Tharava as though hopeful for a word of praise. Without so much as a look at her, the two wise ones started toward the river of Shido, their heads together, talking. After a moment, the Aes Sedai scowled and lifted her robes, hurrying after them as quickly as she could. She glanced back more than once, though. Fail had the feeling that she did it even after the falling snow had hidden between them. More Gaishine came the other way, a dozen men and women, and only one was Aiel, a lanky redhead with a thin white scar from hairline to jaw. Fail recognized short, pallid Kyrianan, and others she thought might be Amadisian or Altaran, taller and darker, and even a bronze-skinned Domani. The Domani and one of the other women wore wide belts of shiny golden chain tight around their waists, and collars of the flat links around their necks. So did one of the men. In any case, jewelry on Gaishine seemed unimportant except as an oddity, especially alongside the food and clothing they brought. Some of the newcomers carried baskets with loaves of bread and yellow cheese and dried beef, and the Gaishine already there with their water bags of tea provided drink to wash it down. Fail was not alone in stuffing her mouth with unseemly haste even while she dressed, clumsily and with more mind to speed than modesty. The hooded white robe and two thick underrobes seemed wondrously warm, just to keep the air off, and so were heavy woolen stockings and soft Aiel boots that laced to her knees. Even the boots had been bleached white, but they did not fill up the hole in her middle. The meat was tough as boot leather, the cheese nearly rock hard, and the bread not much softer, yet they tasted like a feast. Her mouth watered at every bite. Chewing a mouthful of cheese, she knotted the last bootlace and stood, smoothing down her breath. As she reached for some more bread, one of the women wearing gold, plump and plain and weary-eyed, took another belt of golden chain out of a cloth sack hanging from her shoulder. Hastily swallowing, Fail stepped back. I would rather not have that. She had a sinking feeling that her wrongs dismissed the adornment as unimportant. What you want does not matter, the plump woman replied tiredly. Her accent was Amadisian and cultured. You serve the Lady Savannah now. You will wear what you are given and do as you are told, or you will be punished until you see the error of your ways. A few paces away, Magdan was fending off the Domani, resisting being fitted with a collar. Alejandra was backing away from the man who wore golden chains, her hands raised and a sickly expression on her face. He held out one of the belts toward her. Thankfully, they were both looking to Fail, though. Perhaps that switching in the forest had done some good. Exhaling heavily, Fail nodded to them, then allowed the plump Gaishine to fasten the wide belt around her. With her example, the other two let their hands fall. It seemed one blow too many for Alejandra, who stood staring at nothing as she was belted and collared. Magdan did her best to glare a hole through the slim Domani. Fail tried smiling with but smiling was difficult. To her, the collar's catch snapping shut sounded like a prison door being locked. Belt and collar could be removed as easily as they had been put on, but Guy Shine serving the Lady Savannah surely would be watched very closely. Disaster was piling on disaster. Things had to get better from here on. They had to. Soon Fail found herself tramping through the snow on wobbly legs with a startling, dull-eyed Alejandra and startling Megden, surrounded by shine-leading pack animals, carrying large covered baskets on their backs, dragging loaded barrows with the wheels lashed to wooden sleds. The carts and wagons had sleds or broad runners, too, with the wheels tied on top of the snow-shrouded cargo. Snow might be unfamiliar to the Shido, but they had learned something of traveling in it. Neither Fail nor the other two bore any burdens, though the plump Amadisian woman made clear that they would be expected to carry or haul tomorrow and from then on. However many Shido were in the column, it seemed a great city on the move, if not a nation. Children up to 12 or 13 rode on the carts and wagons, but everyone else walked. All of the men wore the cut-in sore, but most women wore skirts and blouses and shawls like the wise ones, and most of the men carried only a single spear, or no weapon at all, and looked softer than the others. Soft, meaning that there were stones softer than granite. By the time the Amadisian left, without giving her name or saying much more than obey or be punished, Fail realized that she had lost sight of Bane and the rest somewhere in the falling snow. No one tried to make her keep a particular place, so she tramped wearily back and forth across the column, accompanied by Alejandra and Megden. Keeping her hands folded together in her sleeves made walking difficult, especially wading through snow, but it did keep them warm. Warmer than the alternative, at least. The wind made sure they kept their hoods well up. Despite the identifying golden belts, neither Guy Shine nor Shido looked at them twice. Despite crossing the column a dozen times or more, however, the search proved fruitless. There were people in white robes everywhere, more than without, and any of those deep cowls could have hidden her other companions. "We will have to find them tonight," Megden said finally. She actually managed to stalk through the deep snow in an ungainly fashion. Her blue eyes were fierce inside the cabin of her hood, and she gripped the broad glittering chain around her neck with one hand as if wanting to rip it off. "As it is, we're taking 10 steps to 1 for everyone else. 20 for 1. It will do us little good to arrive at tonight's camp too exhausted to move." On Fail's other side, Alejandra roused from her numbness enough to raise an eyebrow at the decisiveness in Megden's voice. Fail merely looked at her maid, but that was enough to keep Megden blushing and stammering. What got into the woman? Still, it might not be what she expected from a serving woman, but she could not fault Megden's spirit in a companion for escape. A pity the woman could not channel more. Fail had had great hopes of that once, until she learned that Megden possessed so little ability it was useless. "Tonight it must be, Megden," she agreed, or however many nights it took. She did not mention that. Hurriedly she surveyed the people nearest them to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. The Shido, whether in cut-in sore or not, moved through the falling snow purposefully, pressing toward an unseen goal. The other Guy Shine, moved with a different purpose: obey or be punished. "The way they ignore us," she went on, "it should be possible to just fall by the wayside, so long as you don't try under a Shido's nose. If either of you finds a chance, take it. These robes will help you hide in the snow, and once you find a village, the gold they've so graciously given us will see you back to my husband. He will be following. Not too quickly, she hoped. Not too closely, at least. The Shido had an army here. A small army, perhaps, compared to some, but larger than Perrin's." Aleandra's face hardened in determination. "I will not leave without you," she said softly. Softly, yet in firm tones. "I will not take my oath of fealty lightly, my lady. I will escape with you or not at all." "She speaks for both of us," Megden said. "I may be only a simple maid," she wrung the word with scorn, "but I won't leave anyone behind to these bandits." Her voice was not simply firm, it brooked no opposition. Really, after this, Lini would have to have a very long talk with her before she was satisfied with her position. Fail opened her mouth to argue. No, to command. Aleandra was her sworn woman, and Magdan her maid, however fire-brained captivity had made her. They would follow her orders, but she let the words die on her tongue. Dark shapes approaching through the tide of shadow and the falling snow resolved into a cluster of Aiel women with their shawls framing their faces. Tharava led them. A murmured word from her, and the others slowed to keep pace behind while Tharava joined Fail and her companions. That was to say, she walked alongside them. Her fierce eyes seemed to chill even Magdan's enthusiasm, not that she gave them more than a glance. To her they were not worth looking at. "You're thinking of escape," she began. No one else opened her mouth, but the wise one added, "Do not try denying it," in a scornful voice. "We will try to serve as we should, wise one," Fail said carefully. She kept her head down in her cowl and made sure not to meet the taller woman's eyes. "You know something of our ways?" Tharava sounded surprised, but it vanished quickly. "Good. You take me for a fool if you think I believe you will serve meekly. I see spirit in the three of you, for wetlanders. Some never try to escape, but only the dead succeed. The living are always brought back. Always." "I will heed your words, wise one," Fail said humbly. "Always? Well, there had to be a first time. We all will." "Oh, very good," Tharava murmured. "You might even convince someone as blind as Savannah. Know this, however, Guyshine. Wetlanders are not as others who wear white. Rather than being released at the end of a year and a day, you will serve until you are too bent and withered to work. I am your only hope of avoiding that fate." Fail stumbled in the snow, and if Aleandra and Magdan had not caught her windmilling arms, she would have fallen. Tharava gestured impatiently for them to keep moving. Fail felt sick. Tharava would help them escape? Chiad and Bane claimed the Aiel knew nothing of the game of houses and scorned wetlanders for playing it, but Fail recognized the currents swirling around her now. Currents that would pull all of them under if she misstepped. "I do not understand, wise one." She wished her voice did not sound so hoarse suddenly. Perhaps that very hoarseness convinced Tharava, though. People like her believed in fear as a motivation before any other. At any rate, she smiled. It was not a warm smile, just a curving of thin lips, and the only emotion it conveyed was satisfaction. "All three of you will watch and listen while you serve Savannah. Each day a wise one will question you, and you will repeat every word Savannah said and who she spoke to. If she talks in her sleep, you will repeat what she mumbles. Please me, and I will see that you are left behind." Fail wanted no part of this, but refusal was out of the question. If she refused, none of them would survive the night. She was certain of that. Tharava would take no chances. They might not even survive until nightfall. This snow would hide three white-clad corpses quickly, and she very much doubted that anyone within sight would so much as protest if Tharava decided to slit a few throats then and there. Everyone was focused on moving forward through the snow in any case. They might not even see. If she learns of it, Fail swallowed. The woman was asking them to walk out on a crumbling cliff. No, she was ordering them to. Did the Aiel kill spies? She had never thought to ask Chiad or Bane that. "Will you protect us, wise one?" The hard-faced woman caught Fail's chin with steely fingers, pulling her to a halt, pulling her up on her toes. Tharava's eyes caught hers just as tightly. Fail's mouth went dry. That stare promised pain. "If she learns of it, Guyshine, I will trice you up for cooking myself, so make sure she does not. Tonight you will serve in her tents, you and 100 others, so you will not have many labors to distract you from what is important." A moment's study of the three of them, and Tharava gave a satisfied nod. She saw three soft wetlanders, too weak to do anything but obey. Without another word, she released Fail and turned away, and in moments she and the other wise ones were swallowed by the snow. For a time, the three women struggled on in silence. Fail did not bring up anyone escaping alone, much less give orders. She was certain that if she did, the others would balk again. Aside from anything else, complying now would make it seem Tharava had changed their minds. that fear of her had. Fail knew enough of the other two women to be sure they would die before admitting that the woman frightened them. Tharava certainly frightened her, and I'd swallow my tongue before admitting it aloud, she thought wryly. I wonder what she meant by cooking, Aliandra said. White cloak questioners sometimes turn prisoners over a fire on a spit, I've heard. Magden wrapped her arms around herself, shuddering, and Aliandra freed a hand from her sleeves long enough to pat the other woman's shoulder. Do not worry. If Savannah has 100 servants, we may never get close enough to hear anything, and we can choose what we report, so it cannot be traced back to us. Magden laughed bitterly inside her white hood. You think we still have small choices. We have none. You need to learn about having no choices. That woman didn't pick us out because we have spirit. She almost spat the word. I'll wager every one of Savannah's other servants has had that lecture from Tharava, too. If we miss a word we should have heard, you can be sure she'll know of it. You may be right, Aliandra allowed after a moment. But you will not speak to me again in that fashion, Magden. Our circumstances are trying, to say the least, but you will remember who I am. Until we escape, Magden replied. You are Savannah's servant. If you don't think of yourself as a servant every minute, then you might as well climb onto that spit. And leave room for the rest of us, because you will put us on it as well. Aliandra's cowl hid her face, but her back grew stiffer with every word. She was intelligent, and knew how to do what she must, but she had a queen's temper when she did not control it. Fail spoke before she could erupt. Until we manage to get away, we are all servants, she said firmly. Light. The last thing she needed was the pair of them squabbling. But you will apologize, Magden. Now. Head averted, her serving woman mumbled something that might have been an apology. She let it pass for one in any case. As for you, Aliandra, I expect you to be a good servant. Aliandra made a noise, a half-protest, that Fail ignored. If we are to have any chance of escape, we must do as we are told, work hard, and attract as little attention as possible. As if they had not already attracted what seemed all the attention in the world. And we will tell Tharava every time Savannah sneezes. I don't know what Savannah will do if she finds out, but I think we all have a good idea of what Tharava will do if we displease her. That was enough to settle them all back into muteness. They did all have a good idea of what Tharava would do, and killing might not be the worst of it. The snow faded away to a few scattered flakes by midday. Dark, roiling clouds still hid the sun, but Fail decided it must be near enough midday because they were fed. No one stopped moving, but hundreds of Gaishai made their way through the column with baskets and scrips full of bread and dried beef, and water bags that contained water this time.
Hey, Oscar, how you doing?
Strangely, she felt no more hungry than hours of walking through snow would account for. Perrin had been healed once, she knew, and he had been ravenous for 2 days. Perhaps it was because her injuries had been so much less than his. She noticed that Aliandra and Magden ate no more than she.
I have some,
Healing made her think of Galena, all the same questions that boiled down to an incredulous, why? Why would an Aes Sedai, she must be Aes Sedai, why would she toady for Savannah and Tharava? For anyone. An Aes Sedai might help them escape. Or she might not. She might betray them if it suited her purposes. Aes Sedai did what they did, and you had no alternative but to accept that unless you were Randall Thor. But he was Taviran, and the Dragon Reborn on top of it. She was a woman with very few resources at the moment, and a considerable danger hanging over her head. Not to mention the heads of those she was responsible for. Any help would be welcome from anyone. The brisk breeze failed while she prodded at Galena from every angle she could think of, and the snow came again, growing heavier, until she could not see 10 paces. She could not decide whether to trust the woman. Abruptly, she became aware of another white-robed woman watching her, almost hidden by the snow. Not enough snow to mask that wide, jeweled belt, though. Fail touched her companions on the arm and nodded toward Galena. When Galena saw she had been seen, she came to trudge along between Fail and Aliandra. She still did not move with any grace in the snow, but she seemed more used to walking than they. There was
It's usually
nothing appalling about her now. Her round
what I
face
buy
was
for
hard
my
within her hood, her eyes sharp. But she
I
did keep
guess
turning her head,
what I buy for
darting wary
myself for the
glances
month.
to see
I'll
who
buy
else was
myself
nearby. She looked like a house
an
cat
ounce of
pretending to be
wax
a
and
leopard.
make that last a
You know
month.
who I am? She demanded, but in a voice that would have been inaudible 10 feet off. What I am? You seem to be Aes Sedai, Fail said carefully. On the other hand, you have a very peculiar place here for an Aes Sedai. Neither Alejandra nor Magdan gave the
Mainly
slightest
because I get
start
it
of
for
surprise.
a
Plainly,
decent
they had already
price.
seen the great serpent ring that Galina was thumbing nervously.
So I'm
Color
actually able
bloomed
to
in
afford
Galina's
to do
cheeks,
that once a
and she
month.
tried to make it out as anger. What I do here is of great importance to the tower, child, she said coldly. Her expression said she had reasons they could not begin to comprehend. Her eyes darted, trying to pierce the falling snow. I must not fail. That is all you need to know. We need to know whether we can trust you, Alejandra said calmly. You must have trained in the tower or you would not know healing, but women earn the ring without earning the shawl, and I
smoke
cannot
lots of
believe
flour
you are
too,
Aes
but also
Sedai.
smoke a lot of
It
dabs.
seemed Fail had not been the only one puzzling over the woman. Galina's plump mouth hardened, and she clenched a fist at Alejandra, to threaten or show her ring, or both. You think they will treat you differently because you wear a crown? Because you used to wear one? There was no doubt of her anger. She forgot to keep lookout for listeners, and her voice spittle flew with the force of her tirade. You will bring Savannah wine and wash her back just like the rest. Her servants are all nobles or rich merchants, or men and women who know how to serve nobles. Every day she has 5 of them strapped to encourage her rest, so they all carry tales to her, hoping to curry favor. The first time you try to escape, they will switch the soles of your feet until you cannot walk, and tie you twisted up like a blacksmith's puzzle to carry on a cart until you can. The second time will be worse, and the third worse again. There is a fellow here who used to be a white cloak. He tried to escape 9 times. A hard man, but the last time they brought him back he was begging and crying before they even began stripping him for punishment. Alejandra did not take the harangue well. She puffed up indignantly, and Magdan growled, Was that what happened to you? Whether Aes Sedai or accepted, you are a disgrace to the tower. Be silent when you're better speak, Wilder, Galina snapped. Light. If this went any further, they would be screaming at one another next.
Cause my
If you
ounces I
mean to help
get,
us escape, then say so, Fail
depending
told
on
the
what kind I
silk-clad
get,
Aes Sedai. She
ranges
did not
between
really doubt that about the woman,
100
just
to
everything else.
120.
If not, what do you want with us? Ahead of them, a wagon loomed out of the snow, leaning where one of the sleds had come loose. Directed by a Shido with the arms and shoulders of a blacksmith, Gaishine were rigging a lever to hoist the wagon enough for the sled to be lashed back in place. Fail and the others kept silent as they passed. Is this really your ring, Lady Alejandra? Galina demanded once they were out of earshot of the men around the wagon. Her face was still flushed with anger, her tones slicing. Who is
Cleaning it
she
right
that
now.
you would swear to her? You can ask me, Fail said coldly. Burn Aes Sedai and their bloody secrecy. Sometimes she thought an Aes Sedai would not tell you the sky was blue unless she
And then
saw
load it
advantage in
again.
it. I am the Lady Fail Tebara, and that's as much as you need to know. Do you mean to help us? Galina stumbled to one knee, peering at Fail so hard that she began to wonder whether she had made a mistake. A moment later she knew she had. Regaining her feet, the Aes Sedai smiled unpleasantly. She no longer seemed angry. In fact, she looked as pleased as Therava had, and worse, in much the same way. Tebara, she mused, you are Saldaean. There is a young man, Perrin Abara. Your husband? Yes, I see I've
And
hit
all
the
I
target.
do is load about
That
that
would
much.
explain Aleandra's oath,
Actually,
certainly.
that's a little too much.
Savannah has grandiose plans for a man whose name is linked to your husband, Rand
That
al'Thor.
much.
If she knew she had you in her hands, oh, never fear, she will learn from me. Her gaze hardened,
Maybe a little
and
bit
suddenly
more.
she seemed a leopard in truth, a starving leopard. Not if you all do as I tell you. I will even
Well,
help you get away.
that much more.
What do you want of us? Fail said, more insistently than she felt. Like she had been angry at
Maybe,
Alejandra
let's
for
see.
drawing attention to them by naming herself, and now she had done the same, or worse.
Take a little bit out.
And I thought I was concealing myself by hiding my father's name, she thought bitterly. Nothing too trying, Galena replied. You marked Tharava, of course. Of course you did. Everyone notices Tharava. She keeps something in her tent, a smooth white rod about a foot long. It is in a red chest with brass banding that is never locked. Bring it to me, and I will take you with me when I go. A small thing to do, it seems, Alejandra said doubtfully. But if so, why do you not take it yourself? Because I have you to fetch it for me! Realizing she had shouted, Galena huddled in on herself, and her cowl swung as she watched for eavesdroppers among the snow-veiled throng. No one seemed to be so much as glancing their way, but her voice dropped to a feral hiss. If you do not, I will leave you here until you are gray and wrinkled, and Savannah will hear of Perine Barra. It may take time, Fail said desperately. We won't be free to just sneak into Tharava's tent whenever we want. The last thing in the world she wanted was to go anywhere near Tharava's tent, but Galena had said she would help them. Vile she might be, but Aes Sedai could not lie. You have all the time you need, Galena replied. The rest of your life, Lady Fail Tebara, if you are not careful. Do not fail me. She gave Fail a last hard stare, then turned to labor away into the snow, holding her arms as if trying to hide her jeweled belt behind her iron sleeves. Fail struggled onward in silence. Neither of her companions had anything to say either, and there did not seem to be anything to say. Alejandra appeared sunk in thought, hands in her sleeves, peering straight ahead as if seeing something beyond the blizzard. Megden had gone back to gripping her golden
Just the right
collar in a
amount.
tight
Didn't
fist.
have no splash
They were
over.
caught in 3 snares, not one, and any of the 3 might kill. Rescue suddenly seemed very attractive. Somehow, though, Fail intended to find her way out of this trap. Pulling her hand away from her own collar, she fought through the snow, plunging.
Chapter 5. Flags. He ran across the snow-covered plain, nose into the wind, hunting for a scent, for that one precious scent. The falling snow no longer melted on his chilled fur, but cold could not deter him. The pads of his paws were numb, yet his burning legs worked furiously, carrying him on, faster and faster, till the land blurred in his eyes. He had to find her. Suddenly a great grizzled gray wolf, ragged-eared and scarred from many fights, settled down out of the sky to race the sun beside him. Another great gray wolf, but not so large as himself. His teeth would tear the throats of those who had taken her. His jaws would crush their bones. Your she is not here, Hopper sent to him. But you are here too strongly, and too long from your body. You must go back, young bull, or you will die. I must find her. Even his thoughts seemed to pant. He did not think of himself as Perine Barra. He was young bull. Once he had found the falcon here, and he could again. He had to find her. Beside that need, death was nothing. In a flash of gray, the other wolf lunged against his side. And though young bull was the larger, he was tired, and he fell heavily. Scrambling to his feet in the snow, he snarled and launched himself at Hopper's throat. Nothing mattered more than the falcon. The scarred wolf flew into the air like a bird, and young bull went sprawling. Hopper lighted on the snow behind him. Hear me, cub. Hopper thought at him fiercely. Your mind is twisted with fear. She is not here, and you will die if you remain longer. Find her in the waking world. You can only find her there. Go back and find her. Perrin's eyes snapped open. He was bone-tired, and his middle felt hollow, but hunger was a shadow beside the hollowness in his chest. He was all hollow, and distanced even from himself, as if he were another person watching Perine Barra suffer. Above him, a blue and gold-striped tent roof rippled in the wind. The interior of the tent was dim and shadowed, but sunlight made the bright canvas glow softly. And yesterday had not been a nightmare any more than Hopper was. Light, he had tried to kill Hopper. In the wolf dreams, death was final. The air was warm, but he shivered. He was lying on a feather mattress in a large bed with heavy corner posts thickly carved and gilded. Through the scent of charcoal burning in the braziers, he smelled musky perfume, and the woman wearing it. No one else was present. Without raising his head from the pillow, he said, "Have they found her yet, Berylane?" His head felt too heavy to lift. One of her camp chairs squeaked faintly as she shifted. He had been here before often, with Fail, to discuss plans. The tent was big enough to house a family, and Berylane's elaborate furnishings would not have looked out of place in a palace, all intricate carving and gilt, though everything, tables and chairs, and the bed itself was held together with pegs. They could be disassembled for storage on a cart, but the pegs did not make for true sturdiness. Under the perfume, Berylane smelled of surprise that he knew she was there, yet her voice was composed. "No, your scouts haven't returned yet. And mine... When they didn't return by nightfall, I sent a full company. They found my men dead in an ambush, killed before they had gone more than 5 or 6 miles. I ordered Lord Galen to keep a tight watch around the camps. Arganda has a strong guard mounted too, but he sent patrols out, against my advice. The man's a fool. He thinks no one can find Alejandra but him. I am not sure he believes anyone else is really trying. Certainly not the Aiel." Perrin's hands tightened on the soft wool blankets covering him. Gaul would not be caught by surprise, or Jondin, not even by Aiel. They were still hunting, and that meant Fail was alive. They would have been back long since if they had found her body. He had to believe that. He lifted one of the blue blankets a trifle. Beneath them, he was bare. "Is there an explanation for this?" Her voice did not change, but caution shimmered in her scent. "You and your armsmen might have frozen to death if I hadn't gone looking for you when Narelle returned with news of my scouts. No one else had the nerve to disturb you. Apparently, you snarled like a wolf at everyone who did. When I found you, you were so numb you couldn't hear anyone speak to you, and the other man was ready to fall on his face. Your woman Linny kept him. All he needed was hot soup and blankets. But I had you carried here. You might have lost some toes at best without Anura. She seemed afraid you might die even after she healed you. You slept like a man already dead. She said you almost felt like someone who had lost his soul, cold no matter how many blankets were piled on you. I felt it as well when I touched you." Too much explanation, and not enough. Anger flared, a distant anger, but he hammered it down. Fail was always jealous when he raised his voice to Berylane. The woman would get no shouts from him. "Grady or Niald could have done whatever was necessary," he said in a flat voice. "Even Seonid and Masuri were closer. My own advisor came to mind first. I never thought of the others till I was almost back here. Anyway, does it matter who did the healing?" So plausible. And if he asked why the First of Mayen herself was watching over him in a half-dark tent instead of her serving woman, or some of her soldiers, or even Anura, she would have another plausible answer. He did not want to hear it. "Where are my clothes?" he asked, propping himself up on his elbows. His voice still had no expression. A single candle on a small table beside Berylane's chair gave the only real light in the tent, but it was more than enough for his eyes, even grainy with tiredness as they were. She was garbed demurely enough, in a dark green riding dress with a high neck that nestled her chin in a thick ruff of lace. Putting demure on Berylane was like putting a sheepskin on a ridge cat. Her face was faintly shadowed, beautiful and untrustworthy. She would do what she promised, but like an Aes Sedai for her own reasons, and the things she had made no promises about could stab you in the back. On the chest over there, she said, gesturing with a graceful hand nearly hidden in pale lace. I had Rosine and Nana clean them, but you need rest and food more than clothing. And before we get to food and business, I want you to know that no one hopes Fail is alive more than I. Her expression was so open and honest, he could have believed her had she been anyone else. She even managed to smell honest. I need my clothes now. He twisted around to sit up on the side of the bed with the blankets pulled across his legs. The clothes he had been wearing lay neatly folded on a banded travel chest that was carved and gilded within an inch of its life. His fur-lined cloak was draped across one end of the chest, and his axe leaned next to his boots on the brightly flowered carpets layered for a floor. Light, he was tired. He did not know how long he had been in the wolf dream, but awake there was awake as far as your body was concerned. His stomach rumbled loudly. And food. Verle made an exasperated sound in her throat and rose, smoothing her skirts, her chin lifted high with disapproval. Anura will not be pleased with you when she comes back from talking with the wise ones, she said firmly. You can't just ignore Aes Sedai. You are not Rand al'Thor, as they will prove to you sooner or later. But she left the tent, letting in a swirl of cold air. In her displeasure, she did not even bother to take a cloak. Through the momentary gap in the entry flaps, he saw that it was still snowing. Not as hard as last night, but white flakes drizzled down steadily. Even Jondin would have difficulty finding sign after last night. He tried not to think about it.
Excuse me.
4 braziers warmed the air in the tent, but ice seeped into his feet as soon as they hit the carpets, and he hurried to his clothes. Tottered to them, really, though not dallying about it. He was so tired he could have lain down on the carpets and gone to sleep again. On top of that, he felt weak as a newborn lamb. Perhaps the wolf dream had something to do with that, too, going there as strongly as he had, abandoning his body. But healing likely had exacerbated matters. With nothing to eat since yesterday's breakfast and a night spent standing in the snow, he had had no reserve to draw on. Now his hands fumbled with the simple task of putting on his small clothes. Jondin would find her, or Gaul would. Find her alive. Nothing else in the world mattered. He felt numb. He had not expected Berlaine to return herself, but a gust of cold entered, carrying her perfume, while he was still drawing on his breeches. Her gaze on his back was like stroking fingers, but he made himself go on as if alone. She would not have the satisfaction of seeing him hurry because she was watching. He did not look at her. Rosine is bringing hot food, she said. There is only mutton stew, I'm afraid, but I told her enough for 3 men. She hesitated, and he heard her slippers shift on the carpets.
It's okay, buddy.
She sighed softly.
It's okay.
Perrin, I know you are hurting. There are things you might want to say, but you can't to another man. I can't see you crying on Lenny's shoulder, so I offer mine. We can call a truce until Fail is found. A truce, he said, carefully bending to tug on a boot, so he did not fall over. Stout wool stockings and thick leather soles would have his feet warm soon enough. Why do we need a truce? She was silent while he donned the other boot and folded the turn-downs below his knees, not speaking until he had done up the laces of his shirt and was stuffing it into his breeches. Very well, Perrin, if that is how you want it. Whatever that was supposed to mean, she sounded very determined. Suddenly he wondered whether his nose had failed him. Her scent was affronted, of all things. When he looked at her, though, she wore a faint smile. On the other hand, those big eyes held a glint of anger. The Prophet's men began arriving before daylight, she said in a brisk voice, but as far as I know, he hasn't come himself yet. Before you see him again, began arriving, he broke in. Mosima agreed to bring only an honor guard, 100 men. Whatever he agreed, There were 3,000 or 4,000 the last I looked. An army of ruffians, every man within miles who could carry a spear, it seemed, and more coming from every direction. Hurriedly, he shrugged into his coat and buckled his belt over it, settling the weight of his axe at his hip.
Okay, buddy.
It always felt heavier than it
Won't
should.
be much longer.
We will see about that. Burn me, I won't be lumbered with his murderous vermin. His vermin are an annoyance compared to the man himself. The danger lies with Massima. Her voice was cool, but tightly leashed fear quivered in her scent. It always did when she spoke of Massima. The sisters and the wise ones are right about that. If you need more proof of it than your own eyes, he has been meeting with the Shonchan. That hit him like a hammer, especially after Bulwer's news of the fighting in Altara. How do you know? He demanded. Your thief catchers? She had a pair brought from Mayan, and she sent them off to learn what they could at every town or village. Between them, they never discovered half of what Bulwer did. Not that she told him anyway. Verlaine shook her head slightly, regretfully. Aiel's retainers. 3 of them found us just before the Aiel attacked. They had talked with men who saw a huge flying creature land. She shivered a little too ostentatiously, but by her smell it was a true reaction. No surprise. He had seen some of the beasts once, and a Trolloc did not look more like Shadow Spawn. A creature carrying a passenger. They traced her to Avila, to Massima. I don't believe it was a first meeting. It has the sound of practice to me. Suddenly her lips curved in a smile, slightly mocking, flirtatious. This time her scent matched her face. It was not very nice of you to make me think that dried-up little secretary of yours was finding out more than my thief-catchers when you have 24 eyes and ears masquerading as Fail's retainers. I must admit you had me fooled. There are always new surprises to find in you. Why do you look so startled? Did you really think you could trust Massima after all we've seen and heard? Perrin's stare had little to do with Massima. That news could mean a great deal, or nothing at all. Perhaps the man thought he could bring the Shonchan to the Lord Dragon, too. He was mad enough for it. But Fail had those fools spying, sneaking into Avila? And the light knew where else? Of course, she always said spying was a wife's work, but listening to gossip around a palace was one thing. This was altogether different. She could have told him, at least. Or had she kept quiet because her retainers were not the only ones poking their noses where they should not? It would be just like her. Fail truly did possess a falcon's spirit. She might think it fun to spy herself. No, he was not going to get angry with her. Certainly not now. But she would think it was fun. I am glad to know you can be discreet, Verlaine murmured. I would not have thought it in your nature, but discretion can be a fine thing, especially now. My men were not killed by Aiel, unless Aiel have taken to using crossbows and axes. His head jerked up, and despite his best intentions, he glared at her. You just slipped that in. Is there anything else you've forgotten to tell me? Anything that escaped your mind? How can you ask? She almost laughed. I would have to strip myself naked to reveal more than I already have. Spreading her arms wide, she twisted slightly like a snake, as if to demonstrate. Perrin growled in disgust. Fail was missing. The light only knew whether she was alive. I'd let her be alive. And Verlaine chose now to flaunt herself worse than she ever had before. But she was who she was. He should be grateful she had clung to decency long enough for him to dress. Eyeing him thoughtfully, she ran a fingertip along her lower lip.
Give me one second, I'll be right back.
May have heard, you will be only the 3rd man to share my bed. Her eyes were smoky, Yet she might have been saying he was the third man she had spoken to that day. Her scent. The only thing that came to mind was a wolf eyeing a deer caught in brambles. The other two were politics. You will be pleasure. In more ways than one, she finished with a surprising touch of bite. Just then, Rosine bustled into the tent in a billow of icy air, her blue cloak thrown back and carrying an oval silver tray covered with a white linen cloth. Perrin snapped his mouth shut, praying she had not overheard. Smiling, Berelaine seemed not to care. Setting the tray on the largest table,
Snoopy,
the
don't
stout
be
serving
that way.
woman spread her blue and gold striped skirts in a deep curtsy for Berelaine, and another shorter for him. Her dark eyes lingered on him a moment, and she smiled, as pleased as her
Dog's
mistress,
upset that
for
I ain't
gathering
gone to
her cloak
bed yet.
together and hurrying out again at a quick gesture from Berelaine.
He usually does around this time.
She had overheard, all right. The tray gave off the smells of mutton stew and spiced wine that made Perrin's belly rumble again. But he would not have stayed to eat if his legs had been broken. Flinging his cloak around his shoulders, he stalked out into the soft snowfall, tugging on his gauntlets. Heavy clouds shrouded the sun, but dawn was a few hours past by the light. Paths had been beaten through the snow on the ground, yet the white drifting out of the sky was piling up on bare branches and giving the evergreens new coats. This storm was far from finished. Light, how could the woman talk to him that way? Why would she talk that way? And now? Remember, Berelaine called after him, making no effort to mute her voice. Discretion. With a wince, he quickened his step. A dozen paces from the great striped tent, he realized he had forgotten to ask the location of Misima's men. All around him, the winged guards were warming themselves at campfires, armored and cloaked, and near to their saddled mounts on the horse lines. Their lances stood close at hand in steel-tipped cones that trailed red streamers in the wind. Despite the trees, a straight line could have been drawn through any row of those fires, and they were even as near the same size as humanly possible. The supply carts they had acquired coming south were all loaded, the horses harnessed, and they were arrayed in rigid lines too. The trees did not hide the crest of the hill completely. 2 Rivers men still stood guard up there, but the tents were down, and he could make out loaded pack horses. He thought he saw a black coat, too, one of the Ashaman, though he could not see which. Among the Gieldanen, knots of men stood staring up the hill, yet all in all they appeared as ready as the Mayanners. The 2 camps were even laid out alike, but nowhere was there any sign that thousands of men were gathering, no broad trampled paths in the snow to follow.
Hey,
For that
Runny Bear,
matter,
how you
there were no
doing?
footprints between the 3 camps at all.
Glad you can
Nora
make
was
it
with the
this
wise
night.
ones. She had
Cheers.
been on the hill for some time. What were they talking about? Probably how to kill Misima without him finding out they were responsible. He glanced at Berelaine's tent, but the thought of going back in there with her made his hackles rise. One other tent remained up, not far away, the smaller striped tent belonging to Berelaine's 2 serving women. Despite the drizzling snow, Rosine and Nana sat on camp stools in front of the smaller tent, cloaked and hooded and warming their hands over a small fire. Alike as 2 peas in the pod, neither was pretty, but they had company, likely the reason they were not huddled around a brazier inside. Doubtless Berelaine insisted on more propriety in her serving women than she managed for herself. Normally, Berelaine's thief-catchers seldom seemed to speak more than 3 words together, at least in Perrin's hearing, but they were animated and laughing with Rosine and Nana. Plainly dressed, the pair was so nondescript you would not notice one bumping into him on the street. Perrin was still not sure which was Santez and which Gendar. A small kettle set off to one side of the fire smelled of mutton stew. He tried to ignore it, but his stomach growled anyway. Talk stopped as he approached, and before he reached the fire, Santez and Gendar glanced from him to Berelaine's tent, faces absolutely blank, then pulled their cloaks around them and hurried away, avoiding his eyes. Rosine and Nana looked from Perrin to the tent and tittered behind cupped hands. Perrin did not know whether to blush or howl. Would Would you by any chance know where the Prophet's men are gathering? He asked. Keeping his voice level was hard with all their arched eyebrows and smirks. Your mistress forgot to tell me exactly. The pair exchanged looks hidden by their hoods and giggled behind their hands again. He wondered whether they were brainless, but he doubted Berelaine would tolerate fluff brains around her for long. After a great deal of tittering interspersed with quick glances at each other, at Berelaine's tent, Nana allowed as how she was not really sure, but thought it was that way, waving a hand vaguely toward the southwest. Rosine was certain she had heard her mistress say it was no more than 2 miles, or maybe 3. They were still giggling when he strode away. Maybe they really were goose-brained. Wearily, he tramped around the hill, thinking about what he had to do. The depth of snow he had to wade through once he left the Mayenner camp made his foul mood no better, nor did the decisions he reached. It only got fouler after he arrived where his own people were camped. Everything was as he had ordered. Cloaked Kyrianen sat on loaded carts with the reins looped around a wrist or tucked under a haunch, and other short figures moved along the lead lines of remounts, soothing the haltered horses. The 2 Rivers men, not on the hilltop, squatted around dozens of small fires scattered through the trees, dressed to ride and holding their horses' reins. There was no order to them, not like the soldiers in the other camps, but they had faced Trollocs and Aiel. Every man had his bow slung across his back and a full quiver on his hip, sometimes balanced by a sword or a short sword as well. For a wonder, Grady was at one of the fires. The 2 Ashaman usually kept a little apart from the other men, and the other way around as well. No one was talking, just concentrating on staying warm. The glum faces told Perrin that Jondon had not returned yet, nor Gaul, nor Elias, or anybody else. There was still a chance they would bring her back, or at least find where she was held. For a time it seemed those were the last good thoughts he would have for the day. The Red Eagle of Manetheren and his own wolf's head banner hung limp in the falling snow on 2 staffs leaning against a cart. He had planned to use those flags with Massima in the same way he had to come south, hiding in the open. If a man was mad enough to try reclaiming Manetheren's ancient glories, no one looked further to any other reason for him marching with a small army, and so long as he did not linger, they were far too pleased to see the madman ride on to try stopping him. There were enough troubles in the land without calling more down on your head. Let someone else fight and bleed and lose men who would be needed come spring planting. Manetheren's borders had run almost to where Murundi now stood, and with luck, he could have been into Andor, where Rand had a firm grip before having to give up the deception. That was changed now, and he knew the price of changing. A very large price. He was prepared to pay, only it would not be he who paid. He would have nightmares about it, though.
Oh, shit.
Chapter
At
6.
least you got your phone back.
The
That's
Scent
a good
of
thing.
Madness.
Because losing a phone
Seeking
sucks.
through the falling snow for Denel, Perrin found him at one of the fires and pushed between the horses. The other men straightened and backed away enough to give him room. Not knowing whether to offer sympathy, they barely looked at him and jerked their eyes away when they did, hiding their faces in their cowls. Do you know where Massima's people are? He asked, then had to conceal a yawn behind his hand. His body wanted sleep, but there was no time. About 3 miles south and west, Denel replied in a sour voice, and tugged irritably at his mustache. So the goose brains had been right after all. Flocking in like ducks into the waterwood in autumn, and a lot of them looked like they'd skin their own mothers. Horse-faced Lem Al-Dai spat in disgust through the gap in his teeth he had gotten tussling with a wool merchant's guard long ago. Lem liked to fight with his fists. He looked eager to pick a scrap with some of Massima's followers.
What are you doing up this
They
late,
would,
Running Bear?
If Massima said to, Perrin said quietly. Best you make sure everybody remembers that. You've heard how Berelaine's men died? Denel gave a sharp nod, and some of the others shifted their boots and muttered angrily under their breath. Just so you know, there's no proof of anything yet. Lem snorted, and the rest looked about as bleak as Daniel. They had seen the corpses Massima's followers left behind. The snow was picking up, fat flakes that dotted the men's cloaks. The horses kept their tails tucked in against the cold. It would be a full blizzard again in a few hours, if not sooner. No weather to be leaving the fire's warmth. No weather to be on the move. Bring everybody off the hill and start toward where the ambush was, he ordered. That was one of the decisions he had made walking back. He had delayed too long already, no matter who or what was out there. The renegade Aiel had too much lead as it was, and if they were headed in any direction but south or east, someone would have brought word by this time. By this time, they would expect him to be following. We'll ride until I have a better idea where we're heading. Then Grady O'Neill will take us there through a gateway. Send men to Berlin and Arganda. I want the Mayenners and Gael Donnan moving too. Put scouts out and flankers. And tell them not to look for Aiel so hard they forget there are others who might want to kill us.
Sunshine. Nice.
I don't want to stumble into anything before I know it's there. And ask the wise ones to stay close to us. He would not put it past Arganda to try putting them to the question, in spite of his orders. If the wise ones killed some of the Gael Donnan defending themselves, the fellow might strike out entirely on his own, fealty or no. He had the feeling he was going to need every fighting man he could find. Be as firm as you dare. Daniel took in the flood of orders calmly, but at the last his mouth twisted in a sickly grimace. Likely, he would as soon try to be firm with the women's circle back home. As you say, Lord Perrin, he said stiffly, touching a knuckle to his forehead before he swung into his high-cantled saddle, and began calling out orders. Surrounded by men scrambling to mount, Perrin caught Kenley Mayeron's sleeve, while the young man still had one foot in his stirrup, and asked him to have Stepper saddled and brought. With a wide grin, Kenley knuckled his forehead. As you say, Lord Perrin, right away. Perrin growled inside his head as Kenley tramped toward the horse lines, pulling his brown gelding behind. The young whelp should not grow a beard if he was going to scratch at it all the time. The thing was straggly anyway. Waiting for his horse, he moved close to the blaze. Fail said he had to live with all the Lord Perrining and bowing and scraping, and most of the time he managed to ignore it. But today it was another drop of bile. He could feel a chasm growing wider between him and the other men from home, and he seemed to be the only one who wanted to bridge it. Gil found him muttering to himself as he held his hands out to the flames. Forgive me for bothering you, my lord, Gil said, bowing and briefly snatching off his floppy hat to reveal a thinly thatched scalp. The hat went right back on his head again to keep off the snow. City-bred, he felt the cold badly. The stout man was not obsequious, few Camelin innkeepers were, but he seemed to enjoy a certain amount of formality. He had certainly fitted into his new job well enough to please Fail. It's young Talonvor. At first light, he saddled his horse and went off. He said you gave him permission. If the search parties hadn't got back by then. But I wondered, since you wouldn't let anyone else go. The fool. Everything about Talonvor marked him an experienced soldier, though he had never been very clear about his background. But alone against Aiel, he was a hare chasing weasels. Light, I want to be riding with him. I shouldn't have listened to Berlin about ambushes. But there had been another ambush. Arganda's scouts might end the same way. But he had to move, he had to. Yes, he said aloud. I told him he could. If he said otherwise, he might have to take notice later. Lords had to do that sort of thing. If he ever saw the man alive again. You sound as though you want to go hunting yourself.
Yeah, shit, that's crazy.
I am very fond of Maegden, my lord, Gil replied.
Quiet dignity marked his voice, and a degree of stiffness, as though Perrin had said he was too old and fat for the task. He certainly smelled of vexation, all prickly and ginger, though his cold-reddened face was smooth.
Not like Talonvor, nothing like that, of course. but very important all the same. And of the Lady Fail, of course, he added hastily. It's just that it seems I've known Megden my whole life. She deserves better. Perrin's sigh misted in front of his mouth. I understand, Master Gill. He did. He himself wanted to rescue everyone. But he knew if he had to choose, he would take Fail and let the others go. Everything could go to save her. Horse scent was heavy in the air, but he smelled someone else who was irritated and looked over his shoulder. Linny was glaring at him from the middle of the turmoil, shifting her ground just enough to keep from being ridden down accidentally by men jostling to form ragged files. One bony hand gripped the edge of her cloak, and the other held a brass-studded cudgel nearly as long as her arm. It was a wonder she had not gone with Tallenbor. You'll hear as soon as I do, he promised her. A rumbling in his middle reminded him suddenly and forcefully of that stew he had scorned. He could almost taste the mutton and lentils. Another yawn cracked his jaws. Forgive me, Linny, he said when he could talk. I didn't get much sleep last night. Or a bite to eat. Is there anything? Some bread? And whatever's to hand? Everyone's eaten long since, she snapped. The scraps are gone and the kettle's cleaned and stored away. Sup from too many dishes, and you deserve a bellyache that'll split you open, especially when they're not your dishes. Trailing off into dissatisfied mutters, she scowled at him a moment longer before stalking away, glaring at the world.
Oh no.
Dishes, Perrin muttered.
It's hard to say with that, Running Bear.
That's my trouble, not a bellyache. Lenny was making her way across the campground, threading away between horses and carts. 3 or 4 men spoke to her in passing, and she barked at every one, even shaking her cudgel if they failed to take the hint. The woman must be out of her mind, or Megden. Or was that one of her sayings? They usually make more sense than that. Well, as to that now, Gil snatched his hat off again and peered inside, then stuffed it back on. I have to see to the carts, my lord. Need to make sure all's ready. A blind man could see the carts are ready, Perrin told him. What is it? Gil's head swung wildly in search of another excuse. Finding none, he wilted. I suppose you'll hear sooner or later, he mumbled. You see, my lord, Linny... He drew a deep breath. She walked over to the Mayenna camp this morning, before sunrise, to see how you were, and, why you hadn't come back. The first tent was dark, but one of her maids was awake, and she told Linny... She implied... I mean to say... Don't look at me that way, my lord. Perrin smoothed the snarl from his face. Tried to, at any rate. It stayed in his voice. Burn me. I slept in that tent, man. That is all I did. You tell her that. A violent coughing fit racked the stout man. Me? Gil wheezed once he could talk. You want me to tell her? She'll crack my pate if I mention a thing like that. I think the woman was born in farm Madding in a thunderstorm. She probably told the thunder to be quiet. It probably did. You're Chambayan, Perrin told him. It can't all be loading carts in the snow. He wanted to bite someone. Gil seemed to sense it. Mumbling his courtesies, he made a jerky bow and scurried away, clutching his cloak close. Not to find Linny, Perrin was sure. Gil ordered the household, such as it was, but never her. No one ordered Linny except Fail. Glumly, Perrin watched the scouts ride out through the falling snow, 10 men already watching the trees around them before they were beyond sight of the carts. Light. Women would believe anything about a man so long as it was bad, and the worse it was, the more they had to talk about it. He had thought Rosine and Nana were all he had to worry about. Likely Linny had told Brianna, Fail's other maid, first thing on getting back. And by this time, Brianna surely had told every woman in the camp. There were plenty among the horse handlers and cart drivers, and Kyrienin being Kyrienin, they probably had been eager to pass everything on to the men, too. That sort of thing was not seen with charity in the Two Rivers. Once you gained the reputation, losing it was not easy. Suddenly the men backing away to give him room took on a new light, and the uncertain way they had looked at him, and even Lem spitting. In memory, Kenley's grin became a smirk. The one bright spot was that Fail would not believe it. Of course she would not. Certainly not. Kenley returned at a stumbling trot through the snow, drawing Stepper and his own rangy gelding behind. Both horses were miserable with the cold, their ears folded back and tails tight, and the dun stallion made no effort to bite at Kenley's mount, as he usually would have. "Don't show your teeth all the time," Perrin snapped, snatching Stepper's reins. The boy eyed him doubtfully, then slunk away, glancing back over his shoulder. Growling under his breath, Perrin checked the stallion's saddle girth. It was time to find Messima, but he did not mount. He told himself it was because he was tired and hungry, that he wanted just a bit of rest and something in his belly, if he could find anything. He told himself that, but he kept seeing burned farms and bodies hanging by the side of the road, men and women, and even children. Even if Rand was still in Altara, it was a long way. A long way, and he had no choice. None he could make himself take. He was standing with his forehead sunk against Stepper's saddle when a delegation of the young fools who had attached themselves to Fail sought him out, near a dozen of them. He straightened wearily, wishing the snow would bury them all. Salanda planted herself alongside Stepper's hindquarters, a short, slender woman, with green-gloved fists on her hips and an angry scowl creasing her forehead. She managed to swagger, standing still. Despite the falling snow, one side of her cloak was thrown back to give easy access to her sword, exposing 6 bright slashes across the front of her dark blue coat. All the women wore men's clothing and swords, and usually they were twice as ready to use them as the men, which was saying quite a bit. Men and women alike, they were touchy with everyone, and would have been fighting duels every day had not Fail put a stop to it. Men and women alike, the lot with Salanda smelled angry, sullen, sulky, and petulant, all jumbled together, a scent that twitched uncomfortably in his nose. "I see you, my Lord Perrin," Salanda said formally in the crisp accents of Kyrien. "Preparations are being made to move out, but still we are refused our horses. Will you have this made right?" She made it sound a demand. She saw him, did she? He wished he did not see her.
Oh, have you? That's crazy,
"I'll walk,"
Running Bear.
he growled, and stifled a yawn, not caring
Yeah,
a whit
where
for
you
the
at? You'll be
furious
able to see
glare
the
that
sky a
met
lot
him.
better than
He
around where
tried to
I'm
put
at.
sleep out of his mind. "If you won't walk, ride on the carts." "You cannot do that," one of the Tyran women announced haughtily, one hand tight on the edge of her cloak, the other on her sword hilt. Medora was tall, with bright blue eyes and a dark face, and if she missed beautiful, it was not by much. The fat, red-striped sleeves of her coat looked decidedly odd with her full bosom. "Redwing is my favorite mount. I won't be denied her." "Third time," Salanda said cryptically. "When we stop tonight, we will discuss your tow, Medora Damara." Supposedly, Medora's father was an aging man who had retired to his country estates years ago, but Astaril was still a High Lord for all that. As those things were reckoned, that put his daughter well above Salanda, only a minor noble in Kyrien. Yet Medora swallowed hard, and her eyes widened till she looked as though she expected to be skinned alive. Abruptly, Perrin had had all he could take of these idiots and their dog's dinner of Aiel bits and pieces and pure high-born jack-foolery. "When did you start spying for my wife?" he demanded. They could not have gone stiffer had their backbones frozen. "We carry out such small tasks and errands as the Lady Fail might require of us from time to time,"
Salanda said, after a long moment, in very careful tones. Wariness was thick in her scent. The whole gaggle of them smelled like foxes, wondering whether a badger had taken over their den. Did my wife really go hunting, Salanda? He growled heatedly. She's never wanted to before. Anger roared in him, flames fanned by all the events of the day. He pushed Stepper away with one hand and stepped closer to the woman, looming over her. The stallion tossed his head, sensing Perrin's humor. His fist ached in his gauntlet from its grip on the reins. Or did she ride out to meet some of you, fresh from Abila? Was she kidnapped because of your bloody spying? That made no sense, and he knew it as the words left his mouth. Fail could have talked with them anywhere, and she would never have arranged to meet her eyes and ears, like her spies, in company with Barrelane. It was always a mistake to speak without thinking. He knew about Nasima and the Shonchan because of their spying, but he wanted to lash out. He needed to lash out, and the men he wanted to hammer into nothingness were miles away, with Fail. Salanda did not back away from his anger. Her eyes narrowed to slits, her fingers opened and closed on the hilt of her sword, and she was not alone. We would die for the Lady Fail, she spat. Nothing we have done has put her in danger. We are sworn to her by water oath. To Fail, and not to him, her tone added. He should apologize. He knew he should. Instead, he said, You can have your horses. If you give me your word, you'll do as I say and not try anything
I have no
rash.
idea what any of that means, Running Bear.
Rash was not the word for this lot. They were capable of rushing off alone as soon as they learned where Fail was. They were capable of getting Fail killed. When we find her, I will decide how to rescue her. If your water oath says different, tie a knot in it, or I'll tie you in knots. Her jaw tightened and her scowl deepened, but finally she said, I agree, as though the words were being pried out of her. One of the Tyrans, a long-nosed fellow named Carlin, grunted in protest, but Salanda raised one finger and he shut his mouth. With that narrow chin, he probably regretted shaving off his beard. The little woman had the rest of these fools in the palm of her hand, which did not make her any less a fool herself. Water oath indeed. She did not take her eyes from Perrin's. We will obey you until the Lady Fail is returned. Then we are hers again, and she can decide our toe. That last seemed more for the others than him. Good enough, he told her. He attempted to moderate his tone, but his voice was still rough. I know you are loyal to her, all of you. I respect that. That was about all he did respect in them. As an apology, it was not very much, and that was just how they took it. A grunt from Salanda was the only reply he got, that and glowers from the rest as they stalked off. So be it, as long as they kept their word. The whole bunch had never done an honest day's work between them.
Oh, three
The
different
camp was
directions?
emptying
Okay.
out. The carts began moving south, sliding on their sleds behind the cart horses. The horses left deep tracks, but the sleds made only shallow ruts. The falling snow began to bury immediately. The last of the men from the hill were scrambling into their saddles and joining the others already riding with the carts. Just off to one side, the Wise One's party began to pass, even the Guy Shine leading the pack animals, themselves mounted. However firm Daniel had dared to be, or not, as was more likely, apparently it had been enough. The Wise Ones looked particularly awkward on horseback compared to the grace of Sionid and Missouri, though not so bad as the Guy Shine. The white-robed men and women had all been riding since the third day in snow, yet they crouched low over the tall pommels of their saddles and clung to neck or mane as if expecting to fall off at the next step. Getting them mounted in the first place had required direct commands from the Wise Ones, and some would still slide down and walk if they were not watched. Perrin pulled himself up onto Stepper. He was not sure he might not fall off himself. It was time to make this ride he did not want to make.
he would have killed for a piece of bread, or some cheese, or a nice rabbit. "Aiel coming!" someone shouted from the head of the column, and everything came to a halt. More shouts rang out, passing the word as if everyone had not already heard, and men unlimbered bows from their backs. Cart drivers stood on their seats, peering ahead, or leaped down to crouch beside the cart. Growling under his breath, Perrin heeled Stepper in the flanks. At the front of the column, Daniel was in his saddle, and the two men carrying those bloody banners, but a good 30 were on the ground, coverings stripped from their bowstrings and arrows knocked. The men holding the horses for the dismounted men jostled about, pointing and trying to get a clear view. Brady and Niald were there as well, peering ahead with intent faces, but sitting their horses calmly. Everyone else reeked of agitation. The Ashaman only smelled ready. Perrin could make out what they were staring at through the trees a good deal more clearly than they. 10 veiled Aiel trotting toward them through the falling snow, one leading a tall white horse. A little behind them rode 3 men, cloaked and hooded. There seemed to be something odd in the way the Aiel moved, and there was a bundle tied to the white's saddle. A fist gripped Perrin's heart until he realized it was not nearly large enough to be a body. "Put up your bows," he said. "That's Aleandra's gelding. It must be our people. Can't you see the Aiel are all maidens?" Not a one was tall enough to be an Aielman. "I can barely make out their Aiel," Daniel muttered, giving him a sidelong look. They all took it for granted that his eyes were good, even took pride in it, or used to, but he tried to keep them from knowing how good. Right then, he did not care, though. "They are ours," he told Daniel. "Everybody stay here." Slowly, he rode out to meet the returning party. The maidens began unveiling as he approached. In one of the deep cowls on the mounted men, he made out Furin Alhara's black face. The 3 warders, then. They would have come back together. Their horses looked as tired as he felt, near exhaustion. He wanted to force Stepper to run, to hear what they had to report. He dreaded hearing. Ravens would have been at the bodies, and foxes, badgers maybe, and the light alone knew what besides. Maybe they thought they were sparing him by not bringing back what they had found. No, Fail had to be alive. He tried to fix that thought in his head, but it hurt like gripping a sharp blade barehanded. Dismounting in front of them, he stumbled and had to hold on to the saddle to keep from falling. He felt numb around the bright pain of holding on to that one thought. She had to be alive. Little details loomed large for some reason. Not one bundle fastened to the elaborately tooled saddle, but a number of small bundles that looked like gathered rags. The maidens wore snowshoes, rough made of vines and supple pine branches, with the needles still on. That was why they seemed to be moving oddly. Jondin must have shown them how to make them. He tried to focus. He thought his heart was going to pound through his ribs. Gripping spears and buckler in her left hand, Sulan took one of the small bundles of cloth from the saddle before she came to him. The pink scar running down her leathery cheek twisted as she smiled. "Good news, Perrin Ebara," she said softly, handing him the dark blue cloth. "Your wife lives." Alhara exchanged glances with Sionid's other warder, Terrell Winter, who frowned. Missouri's man, Robert Kirkland, stared straight ahead stonily. It was as plain as Winter's curled mustaches that they were not sure it was good news. "The others press on to see what more they can find," she went on. "Though we already have found oddities enough." Perrin let the bundle fall open in his hands. It was Fail's dress, sliced down the front and along the arms. He inhaled deeply, pulling Fail's scent into him, a faint trace of her flowery soap, a touch of her sweet perfume, but most of all, the smell that was her. And no hint of blood. The rest of the maidens gathered around him, mostly older women with hard faces, though not as hard as Sulan's. The warders climbed down, showing no sign that they had been all night in the saddle, but they held back behind the maidens. "All of the men were killed," the wiry woman said, "but by the garments we found, Aleandra Kagaran, Megden Dorlane, Lasil Alderwin,
and Arella Shigo and 2 more also were made Gaishain. The other 2 must be Bane and Chiad. Mentioning them by name, that they had been taken, would have shamed them. He had learned a little about Aiel. This goes against custom, but it protects them. Winter frowned in doubt, then tried to hide it by adjusting his hood. The neat cuts were like those made skinning an animal. It hit Perrin suddenly. Someone had cut Fail's clothes off. His voice shook. They only took women? A round-faced young maiden named Riane shook her head. 3 men would have been made Gaishain, I think, but they fought too hard and were killed with knife or spear. All the rest died by arrow. It is not like that, Perrin Ibarra, Elienda said hurriedly, sounding shocked. A tall woman with wide shoulders, she managed to look almost motherly, though he had seen her knock a man down with her fist. Harming a Gaishain is like harming a child or a blacksmith. It was wrong to take wetlanders, but I cannot believe they will break custom that far. I am sure they will not even be punished, if they can be meek until they are recovered. There are others who will show them. Others. Vane and Chiad again. What direction did they go? He asked. Could Fail be meek? He could not picture her that way. At least let her try, till he could find her. Almost south, Sulin replied. Much nearer south than east. After the snow hid their tracks, Jund and Baran saw other traces. What the others are following. I believe him. He sees as much as Elias Machera. There is much to see. Thrusting her spears behind the bowcase on her back, she hung her buckler from the hilt of her heavy belt knife. Her fingers flashed hand talk, and Elienda unfastened a second larger bundle and handed it to her. Many people are moving out there, Perrin Ibarra, and strange things. This you must see first, I think. Sulin unfolded another cut dress, this one green. He thought he remembered it on Alejandra. These we recovered.
Actually, that's crazy, Running Bear.
Inside, 40 or 50 Aiel arrows shifted in a heap. There were dark stains on the shafts, and he caught the scent of dried blood.
Recurve bows are nice,
Sulin said, picking out an arrow and immediately throwing it to the ground. Mia Goma. She tossed 2 more aside. Goshin. Those brought a grimace to her face. She was Goshin. Clan by clan, she named them all, except the Shido, dropping arrows until just over half lay scattered around her. She held up the cut dress, holding the remainder in both hands, then spilled them. Shido, she said significantly. Clutching Fail's dress to his chest, her scent eased the pain in his heart and made it worse at the same time. Perrin frowned at the arrows jumbled on the snow. Already some were half buried in the fresh fall. Too many, Shido, he said at last. They should all be bottled up in Kinslayer's dagger, 500 leagues distant. But if some of their wise ones had learned to travel, maybe even one of the Forsaken. Light, he was rambling like a fool. What would the Forsaken have to do with this? Rambling when he had to think. He was as weary as the rest of him. The others are men who wouldn't accept Rand as the Kara Khan. Those cursed colors flashed in his head. He had no time for anything but Fail. They joined the Shido. Some of the maidens averted their eyes. Elienda glared at him. They knew that some had done what he said, but it was one of those things they did not like to hear said aloud. How many altogether do you reckon? Not the whole clan, surely? If the Shido were here in a body, there would be more than rumors of distant raids. Even among all the other troubles, Medicia would know. What's going on with, I'm thinking, Winter muttered under his breath. Perrin was not meant to hear. Reaching in among the bundles tied to the ornate saddle, Sulin drew out a rag doll dressed in cotton sore. Elias Machera found this just before we turned back about 40 miles from here. She shook her head and
for a moment her voice and scent became startled. He said he smelled it beneath the snow. He and Jandanbaran found scrapes on the trees they said were caused by carts. Very many carts. If there are children, I think it may be a whole set, Paranebara. Perhaps more than one. Even a single sept will have at least 1,000 spears, and more at need. Every man but the blacksmiths will pick up a spear at need. They are days south of us, perhaps more days than I think in this snow. But I believe those who took your wife are going to meet them. This blacksmith has picked up a spear, Perrin murmured. 1,000, maybe more. He had over 2,000, counting the winged guards and Arganda's men. Against Aiel, though, the numbers would favor the Shido. He fingered the doll in Sulin's sinewy hand. Was a Shido child weeping over the loss of her doll? We go south. He was turning to Mount Stepper when Sulin touched his arm to stop him. I told you we saw other things. Twice, Elias Machera found horse droppings and campfires under the snow. Many horses and many campfires. Thousands, Alhara put in. His black eyes met Perrin's levelly, and his voice was matter-of-fact. He was simply reporting what was. 5, maybe 10 or more. It's hard to tell. But soldiers' camps. The same men both places, I think. Machera and Baran agree. Whoever it is, they're heading near enough south, too. Maybe they have nothing to do with the Aiel, but they could be following. Sulin gave the warder an impatient frown and continued with barely a pause for his interruption. 3 times we saw flying creatures like those you say the Shonchan use. Huge things with ribbed wings and people riding their backs. And twice we saw tracks like this. Bending, she picked up one of the arrows and drew a rounded shape a little like a large bear's paw in the snow, but with 6 toes, longer than a man's fingers. Sometimes it shows claws, she said, marking them, longer even than one of the big bears in the Mountains of Mist. It has a long stride. I think it runs very fast. Do you know what it is? He did not. He had never heard of anything with 6 toes except the cats in the 2 rivers. He had been surprised to find cats elsewhere only had 5, but he could make a safe guess. Another Shonchan animal. So there were Shonchan to the south, as well as Shido, and what? White Cloaks, or Shonchan army? It could not be anyone else. He trusted Bulwer's information. We still go south. The maidens stared at him, as if he had told them it was snowing. Pulling himself up into Stepper's saddle, he turned back toward the column. The warders walked, leading their weary horses.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into the stream for tonight. Excuse me. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.